Thanks to everyone who's joining. We'll give it another minute to enable all those to come on who want to, and then we'll get underway. Well, let's begin. Welcome to this installment of our Secretary Speaker Series, specifically focused on how do we seize these wet winters and these big storms coming off the Pacific in the winter to address our overall water resilience. My name is Wade Crowfoot, and I lead our California Natural Resources Agency. We're 26 departments spread across the state, stewarding our natural resources as well as our historic and cultural resources. I'm one of many leaders within Governor Newsom's administration focused on building water resilience. And one of our other leaders, Carla Namath, who leads our Department of Water Resources, is joining us today, as well as other colleagues from across the state. Some of you have joined the Secretary Speaker Series before, but for those who haven't, this is a dialogue, an opportunity to lift up big ideas, key priorities, and leaders across California doing big things. We use this opportunity to really tackle important questions of the day. And of course, this discussion around seizing the wet winter is on everyone's mind as we've just experienced yet another set of really snowy storms in California. I want to first of all say Happy Women's History Month. Across our agency, we lift up heritage months. We just completed our Black History Month, and now we have Women's History Month. So I'd ask James to share a slide that shows some of the events we have going this month. If you're interested, we have two events that are targeted for state employees. One is a tour of our state archives here in Sacramento with a specific focus on archival information on women leaders in California. And then for state employees, we're having a family-oriented volunteer work day at China Camp State Park in the Bay Area. Really, for anyone across the state, later this month, we'll be having a career panel interviewing women across the Natural Resources Agency about working in departments within the agency, how they got their job, how they're progressing in their career. And then we'll have another one of these discussions, the Secretary Speaker Series, specifically lifting up women's leadership and the women who are really driving on access, equity, and inclusion in California. So be sure to check those out. A little bit more before we start the discussion here today about how we hold this discussion. My colleague Geeta Chandra, who deserves credit for organizing this discussion here today, is staffing the chat function on your screen. So if you open up the chat, Geeta is going to be providing a bunch of information, including the speakers we're talking to today, and then biographical information on speakers, and then information links that come up in discussion. So be sure to check that out. Also, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At any point during this discussion, if you have a question or an observation that you want to share with us panelists, please click onto your Q&A button and ask that question. Some will be able to answer directly through the text function, and some will bring into our group conversation. Today's discussion is recorded, so about a day after this takes place, really tomorrow, late in the day, if you go to our website, resources.ca.gov, you'll see a recording of this, and you'll have the recording of this discussion and also a copy of all the information that's shared via the chat function. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. As I mentioned, I think all of us are here with a focus on understanding how we capture these big winter storms off the Pacific and winters like we had last year and possibly this year to store more water to get us through the drought periods that we know are returning. And we've got a great set of speakers here today, and Geeta shares that list in the chat. Let's start with our state climatologist, Dr. Mike Anderson. Dr. Anderson does work on both behalf of our Department of Water Resources, as well as our federal agencies focused on water and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Dr. Anderson, welcome. And first, tell us, what does a state climatologist do? You're one of the only state climatologists in the country.
All right. Thank you for having me. So the State Climate Program is a collaborative program between the states and NOAA's Climate Program Office to provide customization of NOAA's climate products and services to meet the needs of the state. So it involves a lot of collaboration, coordination, and communication to make sure that we have the right information that we need to be successful.
And Mike, over the last couple of years, the science that you've been harnessing has been really critical, helping us with emergency preparedness and response in these storms. I know that the modeling that you're doing with so many others has helped our Office of Emergency Services pre-position equipment and vehicle as recently as the last couple of storms.
Right. So we've had the good fortune of making that investment to better understand the character and nature of the storms that provide the bulk of our water supply, but also the bulk of our peril in the extreme events. And those are atmospheric rivers.
Yeah.
And
So
we
you're
had that opportunity to take building that knowledge and put it into action by helping informing critical needs that made us more successful in emergency services and responding to extremes.
Yeah, it's been pretty remarkable to see you at work with our Flood Operations Center, co-managed with the Department of Water Resources, and again, our emergency services. But a whole nother area of your function is helping us look over time at the trends that we're experiencing in California's weather and using that to inform what we need to do with our water management and infrastructure. So if you would, Mike, take us through the last couple of years, which have been extraordinary years, or maybe even the last decade. What is California experiencing now with this weather whiplash that we haven't experienced in the past?
You bet. We have some slides, and so bring those up. That'd be awesome. Here we are. So let's look at the decade from 2013 to 2022. For those of you that remember, back to 2013, really amazing year from the standpoint that we started better than our wettest year on record. We hit New Year's 2013 and the storm stopped. And we did a really hard pivot from wet to dry that began a record setting 4-year drought. Now, what we have on the graphic there are the annual average temperature, the April 1 snowpack, and the annual accumulated precipitation, but it shows where it sits in the historical distribution. And over this time period, we've been in the extremes, in the anomalous. We only have 1 year out of this 10 shown here that landed in an area where it would be expected and where all of our infrastructure and operations activities works really well. And so this decade was an introduction into this is the opening act of what's to come. This isn't the new normal. This is the jumping off point. And so we look to 2023, as you see there, we went from potentially beating the record of 2012 to 2016 drought into a very hard pivot into the wet with extremes that led to extreme flooding, one of the largest snowpacks in the state's history, and also then provided those opportunities for adaptations. Let's go to the next slide, where we really look to how we build a water year. And we start when our fall rains start sometime in October, November. Now, it's really helpful when it happens in October. On average, October 1 is when the fall rains start up at Crescent City, Halloween for San Diego. But we need that first rains to offset the dryness from the summer and have that happen before the snowpack builds up. Snowpack on dry soils means we have to have some of that water go back to wetting the soils before we get the runoff that we can use. Here in 2023, on average, half our annual precipitation shows up in a 90-day window from December 1 to March 1. Last year, we had winter in 3 weeks with that bar B, where we had 9 atmospheric rivers providing 86% of seasonal snowpack and 46% of the annual average precipitation. But we didn't stop there. We added more in March. And then having a massive snowpack to work through a melt season pushed our peak melt well past the normal, almost to June. And then we get into summer and we didn't stop with the extremes as we had Tropical Storm Hillary impact our southern part of our state. Now, if we go to the next slide, and we can talk about where we're doing this year. Unfortunately, we had a dry fall. Rains really didn't get started until we got into December, but when they did, boy, did they come. We had a lot of location-specific extremes. It wasn't spread all across the state, but in bands and locations. A lot along the coast. As we got to our astronomical peak tides or the king tides in December, there was a storm offshore creating huge waves, a lot of coastal impact there. We get into the beginning of February and we have a storm hang up for 3 days right over our most populated part of the state in the LA area. But if you look at the map down there where we are today, the precip, the lower map, and you see those kind of blue extending from Los Angeles up towards Nevada, that streak of storms left a footprint all the way up into Utah. So really impressive extremes. You can see that the blizzard that we just had made a big jump in our snowpack, got us up to average, which is great. But we still have that dry fall, and we still have March to try and accumulate some more until we get to our climatological peak. And everybody likes to talk about the influence of El Nino and La Nina and the fact that El Nino is wrapping up, and we have expectations of El Nino forming for next year. But it's really important to know that this sets the general circulation. It does not set the weather patterns that California experiences. We really rely on the timing, pace, and scale of those atmospheric river storms and their characteristics, how cold or warm they are, to really define how our water picture takes shape each year. Go to the last slide just to kind of wrap everything up, which is kind of trying big picture. So a lot has to go on to get the observations, forecasts, and turn that into usable information that you can use in resource management. Now, we have a lot of fantastic partners working with us that we've cultivated over the last decade to try and get us ready to understand the storms we're dealing with, understanding the information to understand how the watershed is doing, understand then how the water moves through the watershed and how we can take advantage of it. So a lot of exciting work going on, harnessing partnerships, and really working to get the alignment needed from the federal, state, and local levels to make this all go. And that's all for my slides. Secretary, any questions or anything?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. So key takeaways, particularly from your first slide, are weather whiplash is here to stay. Seems like less, rare is the year that's an average year, and it seems like it's whiplashing from back and forth. Let me ask you an impossible question. When can we expect the next drought?
To be as soon as next year. And this is the challenge. We don't have that forecasting capability to look out a year ahead or maybe 2 years ahead. Now we have some partners who are working on that. That will be great if they achieve something. But we're limited only by how far ahead we can see. And that's why we look to make those investments to improve forecasting.
Dr. Anderson, thanks for all that you do, both to help us prepare and respond to storms and then help us think through how we need to change our infrastructure and management to address this weather whiplash. I next want to welcome Carla Namath into the conversation. Most people who work on water in California know that Carla leads the Department of Water Resources, and in that role, really a key leader in the governor's strategy, water supply strategy for a hotter, drier future. So Carla, welcome and thanks for your leadership and your work with Dr. Anderson at DWR. Can you just break down at the highest level of sort of water management how you explain these changes we're experiencing and start to unpack what we're doing about this? How are we seizing these wet years?
Sure. Thank you, Secretary, and it's great to be here, and it's always a joy to follow Dr. Anderson. So, what you touched on and what Dr. Anderson was showing, which was this, the last decade of really intense conditions, in both directions. And taking us back to 2021, it was a remarkable year where we had pretty modest snowpack. But what happened in that year was our runoff efficiency was far lower than we had anticipated. And it happened sort of later in the season, if you will. Our ability to understand that even though we had snowpack, that warming temperatures were melting that in a certain way, some of that surface water was evaporating. It was getting into the very dry soils, and we found ourselves in a pretty tough spot by June, which was a system for sort of understanding what was coming and making decisions about how we operate our reservoirs that really wasn't fitting these emerging new patterns. And that put us in the business, if you will, of understanding, okay, if California as a general matter, we've always had extremely variable precipitation, and that's going to continue into the future. More is going to come as rain and less as snow, and I think we'll talk about that in a bit. But as a general matter, even with that variability, we know that warming temperatures in and of themselves are becoming a new demand on that surface water. And what it means is that, even with this terrific snowpack, less of that snowpack turns into runoff into rivers, streams, and reservoirs than what we would have traditionally seen. Now, there's a lot of complex variables that go into shaping how that happens, but that put us into the business of identifying what we thought this hotter, drier climate was going to do for water management in California. And so we put out a strategy that took us to 2030 and 2040, and it did a lot of important things like recycled water targets, like improving water use efficiency, but it also really talked about building capacity so that we can capture that water when it's wet. So things like expanding reservoirs. We have a Los Vaqueros Reservoir expansion in Northern California. The sort of flagship reservoir, which is our shared reservoir between the state and federal water project, San Luis Reservoir. That's one that is also slated for expansion. And then certainly we have our water storage investment projects that include groundwater projects, but also include the potential for an off-stream reservoir called Sites Reservoir. All of this is about enhancing our water capture capacity so that when we have big years like this one, we're able to store that either in above ground reservoirs or in below ground reservoirs. So I know we're going to have some other panelists talk about the nitty gritty of the work that's being done, in particular for groundwater management, which groundwater capacity is about 10 times the size of our surface water capacity. But then certainly in urban areas, we know that stormwater capture is going to be increasingly important. And we've got some guest panelists who really know those issues inside and out, the promise and the challenges. But it's really all of those things that we need to activate when we get into these very wet conditions. And then finally, Secretary, maybe I'll start with, one of the first things we need to do is operate our current infrastructure better. And so that forecasting information that Dr. Anderson was mentioning is so critical to how we reoperate our existing reservoirs in ways that are more sensitized to incoming weather and can help us really manage both for public safety, but also longer term water supply. And so for instance, how that would work is with improved forecasting, we would have greater confidence that a storm of a particular size is coming in. We'd have greater confidence where it was going to make landfall. And what we would be able to do is evacuate water out of that reservoir in advance to enable us to go store that water someplace else downstream. And that involves working with groundwater sustainability agencies. It involves working with other flood management agencies, irrigation districts, and water agencies. And our ability to do that is going to be crucial to helping us really take advantage of these big events when they come. And one very exciting development in all of that is the Water Resources Development Act, which is the federal act that essentially stipulates resource investment in a really important partner, the Army Corps of Engineers, which is an entity that we think of certainly in all sorts of public safety capacities, certainly in flood management in California. But what's important about the new Water Resources Development Act is they have now included water supply as part of the mission for the Corps of Engineers when they operate these facilities. And that's terrific because that means we have state and federal alignment that we need to be really kind of not only rounding out our hydrologic cycle in the ways that we manage groundwater in connection with surface water, but how we manage flood and drought. And of course, last year was just kind of the poster child of that, where we had coincidental drought and flood emergencies. And we learned an awful lot about how to work through those emergencies in real time to reduce flood risk, but also to create more of a buffer against drought. And then lastly, I'll say all of this relies on quality partnerships with local agencies. And we're not going to get it done in California unless we have those partnerships. And so I'm also very excited to hear from some of our panelists about the work that they're doing on the ground as well.
Carla, thanks so much. And you reminded me that we went into last winter with 6 million Californians underwater rationing. And we had, real conversations about whether that would grow to upwards to about to 20 million after the driest 3-year period in the state's history. And then just a couple months later, we're dealing with these 9 atmospheric rivers, one of the wettest 3-week periods in the state's history. So that weather whiplash. And as you point out, the hotter, drier strategy, the water supply strategy for a hotter, drier future, really based on science that shows us losing upwards of 10% of our water supply by 2040 as a result of those hotter temperatures. So as you pointed out, so much that we need to do in terms of conservation and efficiency and recycling. And then to your point, using that infrastructure that we have more effectively. So I want to dive into last year, because that was such an extraordinary year. And I want to bring on one of the key colleagues of Carla's, and that's Paul Goslin, who leads groundwater at the Department of Water Resources. And Paul, if you would, walk us through sort of what happened last year. We were in a horrible drought. We got these huge storms. We got something like 3 times the normal snowpack in the Sierra Nevada. And we had this huge potential catastrophe of flooding, but then this remarkable opportunity of snow sitting up in the mountains to be captured. So enter in your team and the team at the Water Board and just walk us through how last year developed.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. It's great to be here. Last year was quite remarkable, and I think you Dr. Nemeth just mentioned too. We were going into the 4th driest year, and it was really troubling what we were going to have to deal with, going into that year. But really building upon the drivers for recharge, which had been there for a long time for a lot of water management agencies, who have really built recharge as part of their water management strategy, really became heightened of importance because of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the regulatory requirement to bring basins into sustainability. But additionally, the data that is coming out on the climate extremes from the hotter, drier strategy really heightened the need for recharge. And so we were working real closely with our partners at the State Board and CDFW through the Streamline permit program, trying to target that 500,000 acre feet of recharge each year through the Streamline process. So what we did was somewhat unique. We started a process where we're actually doing regulatory assistance to permittees to get them through the process as quickly as possible. And many of these local agencies have been funded by the state with state dollars to do recharge projects. So it was really incumbent upon us to make sure that they were able to get through the process. And we did see a nice uptick in permit applications towards the end of that year, and Eric will speak to that in a little bit. But as you said, then the atmospheric rivers hit and things dramatically changed. So what we did is we continued to work on those permit applications, but we started to shift working with local agencies and the partnerships we built with the groundwater sustainability agencies to coordinate those reservoir releases and flood impacts to downstream communities, to divert flood flows, to promote recharge, but also, more importantly, to protect downstream communities. We were making calls weekly to upwards of 100 agencies up and down the San Joaquin and Tulare Lake area. And the other important thing is we brought in a lot of the updated data and tools to identify optimal areas that could benefit from recharge, particularly those areas where there's vulnerable wells and areas of subsidence. Importantly, the governor issued an executive order on flood diversions that really was a game changer. It explained and clarified how you could divert flood flows that are posing a risk to downstream communities without a permit. And so it really helped those communities, particularly in the Tulare Lake area, that were facing very severe flooding. So we also found when agencies really started gearing up to divert under the executive order, they reached their capacity with what pumps they had. So we took pretty swift action to acquire and deploy additional pumps to assist those agencies. And then we also learned that there were some areas where these groundwater sustainability agencies had acquired lands for future groundwater recharge basins. And again, going into that year, everyone was assuming it was going to be a dry year. So a lot of these lands were trees and vines were felled, but they weren't cleared and prepped. So we learned that if we could help and assist those agencies clearing those lands, the percolation rate could increase as much as 3 times. So we started using emergency funds and helped assist clearing a number of recharge basin lands to improve percolation. In all these swift actions in 2023 were really built upon the partnership with local agencies, our partners with the State Board and CDFW. So we demonstrated that, a lot can be achieved through planning and a lot of the new data and tools. And we're going to continue to improve and build upon that. So looking into this year, we were prepared for both aspects, for both flood and drought contingencies. We're prepared to work with local agencies, not just in the San Joaquin, Tulare Lake area, but up and down the state, because we don't know where these storms were going to hit. So we were prepared to deploy and interact with local water managers, flood managers, wherever the situation arose, as well as preparing for drought. So I think that the wrap up, it was a real game changer that emergency flood diversions are an important piece to capture flood flows, but the long-term strategy is to increase the amount of permitted recharge capacity. And so we're going to continue to work with CDFW and the State Board to collaborate on streamlined permits and kind of be prepared for the future that is going to be a much more extreme weather conditions, both in drought and flood, and be prepared for both.
And Paul, were you able to track or capture the amount of water that was diverted for recharge? And can we confirm that it was more than usual?
Yeah, and actually, I think all of this is reported into the board. I don't think there had been really much action previous to last year on emergency flood diversions, but there was upwards of almost 400,000 acre feet that was diverted off, which was a pretty substantial amount. And the important thing, besides the recharge component, these were flood flows that were taking off of creeks and streams that were posing an imminent risk to downstream communities. So we don't know if that prevented a blowout or some other disaster, but we did whatever we could to capture that and protect communities and recharge. So we're going to build upon that. The other thing that's remarkable is it opened the eyes to a lot of water managers and growers that, hey, we have flooding downstream routinely here. And under the executive order, now with legislation that was passed, they're starting to think ahead as I'm going to prepare for these common flood events and divert off, protect communities downstream, and also do some supplemental recharge.
Really helpful. And one of these leaders was the Tulare Irrigation District. And we have General Manager Aaron Frucado with us to talk about what happened in that part of California. A lot of attention on the Tulare Lake Basin, a lot of concerns about huge flooding risks. And as I understand it, Aaron, your district moved very quickly to convert some of those flood flows and get them underground. Talk about the process last year and what you were able to accomplish.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, and thank you, everybody. My name's Aaron Fukuda. I'm the general manager of the Tulare Irrigation District and also the interim general manager of the Mid-Cahuilla Groundwater Sustainability Agency. And you're right, we moved quickly, so quickly that actually our actions were in 2022 and in prior years also. So ingrained in our history is the use of conjunctive use operations, which is, applying surface water when we have it for irrigation and groundwater recharge, and then utilizing that groundwater recharge in dry years for irrigation demand. So kind of balancing your supply and demand. But like the prior speakers and the leaders in the state of California managing these extremes, we knew we had to step up our game. And so we did that actually in 2022. So if I could get my slides put up really quick. Thank you. So in 2022, we initiated a grower program that was actually initiated by our growers, acknowledging that we were in an extreme in 2022, which was the dry year extreme. We implemented a groundwater allocation, and key to that allocation, there was a pumping cap that was measured as evapotranspiration. So we reduced our evapotranspiration below our average. We usually use around 3 to 4 acre feet per acre, and we allocated 2.5 acre feet per acre, signaling to our growers that they needed to reduce the demand on groundwater. That was met with tremendous success, where we reduced our evapotranspiration footprint by about 13%. That was the equivalent of 20,000 acre feet, all within a 6-month period there. So that program was put in place as a limiter. And then, forecasters were telling us, get ready for another dry year. We had the program in place and we thought it would, was going to come in handy to cut back moving into 2023. Well, the atmospheric river showed up and we went to flood operations. And so that it quickly turned the corner and we went to our traditional programs. Next slide, please. Oh, can you advance the slide really quick? So one of our ways of doing groundwater recharge is our network of 300 miles of earthen canals. We've adopted a policy to leave our canals earthen, not line them and get the percolation from that. So we have a major distribution system, kind of like the arteries of your body. We can distribute that water throughout a large 65,000 acre irrigation district and let it percolate. We fired every canal up, which we historically don't do that. We only fire up the canals to the recharge basins there, those squares. Next slide, please. We have access to 1,300 acres of recharge basins. Each one of those basins was full to the brim. The joke was our staff was filling the potholes out in the county roads as recharge basins too. So we filled up every place we can get water into, including, next slide, please, what we call winter irrigation. And this was where we stepped up our program and was an outfall of that demand management in 2022. We had developed an online tool where growers can track their allocations and their usage. And what we found out was when we opened up orders in January, instead of our standard 300 cubic feet per second demand, we immediately shot up to about 750 or 800 cubic feet per second, because our growers recognized that over applying water in the winter provided flood control and groundwater recharge, and they received those credits on their water dashboards for future drought years. So now our new philosophy is, instead of one recharge agent in Tulare Irrigation District conjunctively operating, we have 201, which is we have about 200 farm accounts in our irrigation district. I'm also proud to report that not one of our canals went all the way to the top. All of our basins went all the way to the top, and we didn't overtop or flood any of our systems out there. Actually, if it was flooding, it was just recharging in our irrigation district. So next slide. So the outcomes were tremendous for us. Obviously, my little graphic down there, above ground, we diverted about 420,000 acre feet into our irrigation district, which is only 65,000 acres. So it's about 6.5 acre feet per acre. So if you can imagine a 6'5" giant standing next to you, that's how much water column we recharged or brought into our district, I'm sorry. Our early numbers are showing about 4 acre-feet per acre went into the groundwater system, and that depicted to the left there where our groundwater levels rebounded tremendously. That's only as of August. I'm just getting my spring report in right now, and the numbers are even up from there. So we believe we've got a system prepared to manage the dry years and a system prepared to manage the wet years and manage those extremes like we're discussing today. So again, I appreciate the time, look forward to the questions, and ready to see what Mother Nature throws us next year.
Aaron, quick follow-up question. What advice would you have to other irrigation districts that might not be as advanced, that didn't necessarily have this coordination between surface supply and groundwater in the past? What advice towards getting agricultural producers, irrigation districts to seize these wet years?
Yeah, and as I've talked to a lot of people in the state, it's not a common dialogue that you're going to go put water out in your field or even do recharge for that matter. Mainly during winter periods, you're trying to shepherd that off. I think beginning to have those hard discussions about the extremes that we're dealing with and the limits, and making the hard decisions before you have to make them. Because if you wait till you have to make them, usually you're looking in the rearview mirror, and that's what many people did with the 2023 storms. Oh, I want some of that water, but when's the next time that's going to happen? So I encourage to begin that dialogue. You can look at an allocation system. They're not meant for everybody, but they provided the tracking and the crediting system, which got our growers engaged. So my advice is start having a lot of discussions quickly about the hard things that people don't want to do, because you may want to put them in place sooner rather than later.
So helpful. And as Paul pointed out, we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act now in its 10th year. There's a need to bring these basins into balance. And the more that basins can recharge, obviously, the faster and easier that path towards sustainability can be. Thanks, Aaron. I next want to bring in our colleague, Eric Ekdahl from the Water Board, or what is known as the California State Water Resources Control Board. Eric, the Water Board and its regional water boards provide or enforce water standards to protect water quality and enforce the water rights system. So what would you say? What's the Water Board's role in seizing these wet years as it relates to groundwater recharge and then maybe even stormwater capture, which we'll talk about in a little bit?
No, thanks for having me. And I'll follow up on something that Aaron said, which was that, in the moment, it's sometimes hard to do that longer term planning, but that longer term planning is really important. It's sometimes hard to look past the immediate danger of flood and think, well, how can I translate this into the long-term sustainability and the resilience of the entire watershed or the groundwater basin? And to do that, the State Water Board administers the State Water Rights System, which is essentially a level of administration and oversight over ground or water diversions, specifically surface water diversions, and how those can be stored underground. A couple of just high-level comments about why a state administration system is important, because sometimes we do get challenges that say, oh, it's just a bureaucratic hurdle. We have to go through this step. It adds time, it adds expense, but that's really important. Not the time and expense, but that level of administration. Mainly because watersheds are connected, and the activities that go on in the upper part of a watershed can have immense consequences for everyone downstream. That includes agricultural users, it includes the environment, municipalities, domestic users. Some of those uses have been in place for well over 100 years. The oldest rights in California go back to the Pueblo rights for Los Angeles and San Diego going into the 1700s. So this administration is particularly important, maybe not during those immediate flood times, although even then too, but it's really the shoulder years when we have maybe localized wet conditions, localized floods that maybe aren't affecting everywhere else. How can we protect other senior users? How can we protect the environment, but really also maximize that investment? Because when we have those wet winters, that's when we have an excess amount of water that we can more reliably divert, store without those impacts to other users in the environment. So the State Water Board worked very collaboratively with the Department of Water Resources. Paul mentioned the work that we did kind of reaching out, doing technical assistance, and an immense thanks to Paul and the team there for doing that outreach and engagement and really trying to solicit permits, bringing them to the board so that we could develop a number of options. We've been working on a number of opportunities or pathways to kind of streamline that administrative process so that it's not as burdensome. I just want to admit, up front, it is complicated. It's not necessarily easy, but doing that kind of upfront planning, that upfront collaboration is going to be really critical for knowing when and where water is available for diversion and use, especially when we're maybe not in the catastrophic flooding phase, but if we're right on those margins or leading up to it. The board has, over the last couple of years, we've worked collaboratively with the administration and the legislature to develop a new kind of statutory pathway for what we call 5-year temporary permits. We've created internally, we call it an administrative pathway, which means we didn't need a new legislative directive or new regulations to administer it, to capture high flow events. And there's a more detailed discussion we can go into there, but really looking at those flood events and knowing that we can kind of make some assumptions about whether it would affect the environment and other potential downstream users. Over the last 14 months, we've processed 18 temporary permits authorizing more than 1.2 million acre feet of potential recharge. And that's a huge number. We did that very quickly, and a lot, that's over the last year and a couple months, but really most of those just came in between the December and February time periods of both this year and last year. And it shows that, we can move quickly. It shows that we can put these permits in place when they're there, but it also shows we've learned a lot from it. That the advanced planning is one of the key elements that goes into making these permits successful, whether you actually capture water out of it. We've also learned that water's not there every year. If we look at the flood capture that we got all of last year, none of it's been available this year because we haven't had that level of flooding. It also shows that accounting is a major issue, and especially in the water rights frame, knowing who's diverting water, when they're diverting it, and where they're putting it will help actually maximize opportunities for others, because it's going to free up and understand when water is available, particularly if we might not be facing floods that have an imminent health and human safety risk. I think ultimately it points to the need for infrastructure as a limitation on a lot of the permitting projects that come to us, and we can talk maybe more about that in the Q&A session, but doing that advanced planning, understanding what your own infrastructure limits you to, and then doing that kind of engineering and work to build up to really being able to grab high flows when they're available is a key component and next step that we have to point towards. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Eric, huge thanks, and so much to unpack there. We highlighted Aaron Fukuda and the Tulare Irrigation District, a great example of a rural agricultural district leading on seizing the wet years. And next, I want to shift to our largest city in California, one of the largest cities and counties in the country, and bring on Mark Pastrella, who serves as Public Works Director for LA County. If LA County were a state, it would be the 9th most populous state in the country. Mark, you have a huge job, and frankly, have been leading on seizing these big storms, capturing stormwater. So we talk about stormwater as, and the worst of situations, you get the storms, they come through the gutters, bring all that trash through the gutters out to the bay. You all have been contending, with that in 88 cities and across your county, but you've really charted a different path. So talk about what you're doing on stormwater, give us some orientation to Los Angeles, and share with us your recent progress.
Sure. Thank you, Secretary. Appreciate you having me here, and to my colleagues, appreciate all of you. Many of you are partners with us. LA County's been in the business of water conservation and flood protection for over 110 years now. And so it isn't something that we treat as an emergency or an opportunity, but just a way of life. Water conservation, not only at the tap, but water conservation in our big flood control system. And what we've really been doing is optimizing that system over the last several years, and then expanding it in response to the opportunity of these events that we've been talking about today. And in fact, last year and this year are a good example of what can be done when you're prepared and you're making the investments. These investments have to be made long before the event happens. So, just a real quick update. This storm season, we received 17 inches of rain. That's like 112% of our annual average. We've captured 146,000 acre feet, or 47 billion gallons. And for context, that's enough water, Secretary, for 1.2 million people for a year. It's 73% of our annual captured average and 12% of LA County's annual demand. Now, last year, in context, with the wonderful rain we had last year, we captured some 628,000 acre feet, as you can see here in this graphic. And here in LA, we consider that about enough water for 5 million people for a year. With a population of 10 million, that represents about half of the water demand for LA County. And that's all stormwater capture. And, people that, of course, are breaking the myth that all of our water is imported water by capturing this. And we're doing that again through a system of capturing in our reservoir system, 14 major dams and 27 spreading grounds across LA County. And as mentioned, we do that in coordination with 200 water retailers, the largest one being Los Angeles City. This picture here is a picture of the Tujunga spreading grounds in the city of Los Angeles, which we expanded upon last year, and you were there with us as we were celebrating this project. They're examples of what we're doing to increase our self-sufficiency here when it comes to local water supply. We are, in fact, currently capturing about a third of the drinking water supply on an average annual year here for LA County in the form of stormwater. And of course, we're mixing that with reclaimed water and then are still dependent on our imported water system for that. The thing that's going on here is what we're really facing. I think as I said, our strategies are to expand our capacity to capture, but also to maintain the reservoir capacity that we currently have. And one of our big challenges is moving sediment out of the way. Our 50-year sediment plan has been accelerated by the weather whiplash and the fire events that have been occurring, almost to this extent that we're now in like a 20-year plan rather than a 50-year plan. And I have some 500 million cubic yards of sediment to get out of reservoirs. So my advice to those that are getting in the business of recharge and recharge basins is, you got to prep those, and you got to do something with that sediment, not only in the reservoir, not only behind the dams, but also in the spreading grounds themselves. So the plans for that are in place. It's actually paying for it and moving the materials to where we've got the plans to move it to.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I would highlight, the county's leadership securing an ongoing funding source for stormwater capture in what's called Measure W. I think it was a partial assessment that LA County voters passed that provides upwards of $300 million to spread out across the county. And Mark, I understand that that's supporting some really big infrastructure, but also some distributed projects to try to help the water stay in places across the county, whether it's, storm swales and berms and in parks.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just talk a little bit about how that money's getting spread out across the county?
Sure. It's a unique program. I think a lot of people know about it now, but and we refer to it as the Safe Clean Water Program. It was known as Measure W when it was on the ballot. And the unique thing about it, it's a tax, so it required 2/3 of the electorate to actually approve, which we're very proud of. The fact that LA County residents, the entire area of LA County, voted on and approved the tax themselves. And I think it's good for people to know that's about $100 a year per residential property to provide for the program goals. And those goals are, water quality benefits, water supply benefits, which we're touching on today, and also just community investment benefits, green infrastructure and spaces for community, and then investments in disadvantaged communities and job creation. And, I'm proud to tell you, Secretary, that within the first 5 years, the program was able to capture another 18.5 billion gallons a year, enough to serve about 500,000 people a year. And today we've awarded $460 million in funding for about 101 regional infrastructure projects spanning 47 municipalities. This represents about a $1.2 billion investment over the next 5 years in communities across LA County. You asked about some of the projects. Yes, it's everything from, we're looking to unpave LA. So we are putting water everywhere and anywhere we can, including parkways, as you mentioned, in East LA, but also in our North County, creating new spreading grounds, making diversions where we didn't have diversions before, fallowing some ag land and actually putting it into ag land. And then one of the really unique projects that's ongoing is this commingling of the sewer system and the flood control system. Most people say that's heresy, but what we're doing is in dry weather, and in fact, in some stormwater situations, we're diverting through diversions into our treatment system in LA, as well as in the county sanitation system. They are treating that water for us and returning it to the flood control system to be spread in our spreading grounds. And that is been a very, very highly efficient and effective way to capture more of this stormwater. So, the big thing on that is, and I want to mention, and I really appreciate Director Nema's comments. I felt like she was giving my presentation, and that's a good sign. LA County is so aligned with the state and the values the state has put in, the strategies the state has put together. These strategies for LA County are captured in our county water plan, which our 200 water agencies have adopted here locally to get alignment on what our priorities should be. And proud to tell you that stormwater and self-reliance is one of the top priorities for our water agencies here locally.
Mark, huge thanks for being such a powerful model. Let's bring everybody back onto the screen here for the last 10 minutes. And I want to, first of all, share a suggestion that Craig made, which I thought is a great one. He says, there's often news reports highlighting the status almost in real time of our surface reservoirs. Maybe a report or public dashboard to show the status of our aquifers to help motivate more landowners to participate in winter recharge to meet water sustainability goals. I think that's just a great suggestion that I think one will take from here. But Carla and Eric, I want to ask you about resources, because we've talked about infrastructure and a lot of recharge. Not all recharge needs infrastructure, but a lot of it does. So Carla, do you want to talk about any sort of the investment that's occurred toward this? Or Eric, I know the Water Board is a key conduit for federal funding on stormwater capture. Has there been state and federal investment? How should locals take this on?
So maybe I'll start. And a lot of our infrastructure for recharge dollars really comes through money that's identified to implement the sustainable groundwater plans. And so we've put out at least $300 million over the course of the last 2 years, probably a little bit more in multiple grant rounds. Not all of it goes to recharge infrastructure, but a significant subset of that would be supporting some of the technical information folks need to develop, as well as the physical infrastructure to do that. Before I turn it over to Eric Ekdahl, Paul can correct me if I've or if you've got a little bit more to say about that. But also, Paul, can you remind me where we are in terms of our the way in which we reflect groundwater conditions? Because that's a fantastic suggestion, and there's nothing like, getting people engaged to see what's really happening. And we have been putting some elbow grease into making that data available.
Thank you. Those numbers are accurate on the amount of funding that's gone out the door for grants. And that's only part of it. Local agencies, Aaron talked about their investments. So local agencies have put a lot of local money forward. I will say Cal Groundwater Live. I do invite everyone to go look at that. That is a lot of the data we have on groundwater, groundwater levels, subsidence, wells, well permits, dry wells. And we're really moving to take a lot of the tools we have and make it accessible, almost like monitoring and tracking surface water. Difficult to do it under the ground, but we're getting there with a lot of the data in the tool. So I invite people to go take a look at Cal Groundwater Live. If they have thoughts on how to improve it and make it more accessible, please let us know.
Thanks so much, Eric.
And maybe, I'll jump in and talk a little bit about funding. The board over the last, I would say 10 or 15 years has had a couple rounds of bond funding that it's used specifically for things like stormwater capture. And I believe some of the Prop 84 grants actually went to LA for some of the paving and infiltration work that was done there. It's immensely effective, not only at adding to recharge, but also to addressing kind of the other impacts, which is stormwater issues that can arise. We've also been using our Clean Water Fund. That's the federal investment through the Environmental Protection Agency to do things like recycle water that has been used to recharge basins in some circumstances as well. So there's a couple of different opportunities. The bond funds, I think, have been largely expended at this point, but the Clean Water Fund is there every year and can consult with our Department of Financial Assistance to inquire further.
Really helpful. I want to point out a couple of other good suggestions. Mark had identified the benefits of actually permaculture and managing your land so that water can actually stay on the land versus getting off. And then Paul referenced the work that our fish and wildlife colleagues are doing, reintroducing beavers into their historic range. Beavers are incredible to slow the water, to spread the water, and to sink the water, particularly in our mountain meadows. Two great examples of nature-based solutions, as well, of course, this floodplain, this restoring seasonal floodplains, particularly, well, in the Sacramento Valley and in the San Joaquin Valley, where there's a lot of recharge potential as well. Carlo, I think I'd be remiss as we come to, toward the end to just talk a little bit about the state water project. At the end of the day, distributed solutions are so important, but we continue to need the backbone of our water infrastructure to work. And, it's why you and I and the governor continue to make such a strong case for modernizing conveyance through the Delta. Now, that's a complicated and sometimes can bring conflict for folks that don't like this, but I want to make sure that we connect dots around the role that project would play adjusting to these wet years.
Yeah, thanks for that. And the State Water Project, it really is an important piece of backbone infrastructure that feeds so many of our communities with a portion of their water supply. And there is a reason why what to do to modernize and make that system work better at this key point of vulnerability in it is so important, and why governors engage. The State Water Project service area in and of itself is the 8th largest economy in the world. So this is a piece of infrastructure that provides a portion of water supply to the 8th largest economy. It's a big deal, and that's why it's an issue that doesn't go away for California. It is becoming increasingly important as a climate adaptation strategy, largely because, for even just these last 2 years, just perfect examples of especially early season when we have these conflicts. So when we get these big storm pulses early in the season, we call it first flush. And what it does is it sends lots of signals to salmon to start migrating. And so when we get enough of that water starting to move in the system, especially when we're coming off of very intense drought conditions, right now with the infrastructure that we operate, what we actually do is we turn down the pumping infrastructure because we need that salmon to pass safely through the estuary. So that's just a really important example of how our existing infrastructure and climate doesn't work well for the environment, which is really important as we do lots of different things to secure our system. So we estimate that, between this year and last year, it's probably almost 500,000 acre-feet of water that we could not move in a safe way because we didn't have the right infrastructure. And the proposed conveyance facility is about 6,000 cubic feet per second. These are moments when we had almost 150,000 cubic feet per second moving through the system. So these are big events, and just all of our weather whiplash and the charts that Dr. Anderson presented just, I think, really tell the story of why it's important to be able to move water from this part of our state and in this system in a secure way. I would also note that, when the Sacramento San Joaquin system is moving, it's about double the Colorado watershed. The Colorado, serves 7 states, Mexico. It's also a part of our system that supports Westwide and is also needing to adapt to climate. And we need to kind of also on that system get real about, what we can support and what we can do, and everyone needs to use their water a lot more efficiently. But we're going to need it all so that we can have a hedge against deepening droughts. And so it is really a combination of multiple different water supply sources, reusing that water supply, using it more efficiently, and either modernizing or developing new infrastructure that can do less in direct conflict with nature and more in working with nature.
Thank you for that. And those are really great words to end by. You know, it's very clear there's no silver bullet solution to the climate impacts on our water system in this weather whiplash, but I'm really proud of the work that our local partners are doing and our state departments to really double down on these tried and true methods, whether it's groundwater recharge, stormwater capture, actually capture more of this water. And then, as you point out, ensuring the infrastructure that we do have works to capture these big storms and increasingly works with nature. So big thanks to all of you for joining, and thanks to over 400 people who joined us today from across the state. I think we can say we're proud of our progress to seize the wet years and adapt to the new climate reality, with much more work ahead. So thanks for the work, and should I, as always, if you have questions or comments or requests, you can communicate those to us on the email presented here. And once again, thanks to everybody for joining today. Have a great week.